hoochie coochie, the poochie woochie. Does anyone actually know how to pronounce my name? That's right! You deserve a prize! The Chasco. I'm frequently called Cootie or Cody, but please don't shorten it to Pithy. I prefer Cody for obvious reasons. Cootie sounds like something unpleasant. Oh, I'm sorry. I should introduce myself to you. I have surrounded you from the moment you came into West Chasco County. I am the spirit of the lovely Chasco River. Thank you for coming to talk with me today. Perhaps I should tell you a little about myself. My name comes from the Seminole Creek languages. Pillow meaning canoe or boat, and chasquita meaning to cut or chop. Thus, I am the place where canoes are made. So you can see how important I was to the early inhabitants of my shores for travel, hunting and fishing, and the exchange of goods. Nowadays, I'm mostly used for recreation, for families having fun. Oh, that's fun for me too, having them play on my shores or in my waters. Ah, good times, as long as they don't leave any trash behind. Despite my long name, I'm small as rivers go. I'm only 23 miles long and not terribly wide. Compared to the Mississippi, say, I'm a baby. My headwaters are near Cruz Lake on the borders of Hernando and Chasco counties, and I flow to the Gulf of Mexico at Miller's Bayou. I may be small, but I'm an important presence. From the beginning of recorded history in this area, I have been attracted to various groups and individuals. I first attracted early native peoples for my abundant food source and travel. They enjoyed my fish, waterfowl, and lush green plants growing along my banks. I'm sure you've noticed the many Indian names used around here. There's Apopka, which is from the Creek, Aha meaning potato, and Papka meaning eating place. Then there's Homosassa, which is from the Seminole Creek, Homo meaning pepper, and Susi means there, or place where wild peppers grow. Then there's the Mikosuki, which is from the Ichiti, Miki meaning chief, and Suki meaning hogs. This could be hog eaters, or chief of the hog clan, depending on which source you consult. Then there's our capital city, Tallahassee, from the Seminole Creek, Tawa meaning town, and Hassie meaning old, thus Old Town. So you see, there are hundreds of Indian names used all over Florida. Why, you can't move in any direction without bumping into a thing or place name that wasn't derived from a native Indian tribe. One of the earliest tribes in this area was the Tocobaga. The Tocobaga was the name of a chiefdom, its chief, and its major town. The chiefdom inhabited the lands from my shores to below Tampa Bay. The Tocobaga's principal site was the area known today as Safety Harbor. If you visited that town, you may have seen a large mound that was created from their discarded refuse, mostly soil and shells and bones from seafood and wildlife, the principal diet of the Tocobaga. This mound was sacred to the Tocobaga, who created an enclosed structure on the top, which may have been used for religious ceremonies or as a residence to the chief. You may have noticed a similar but smaller mound near my mouth on the Gulf. This mound was also used by the Tocobaga, who had been in this area for more than 1,000 years when the Spanish invaded in the 16th century. The Tocobaga were not the only Indian tribe in this area. As the many Indian names suggest, there were various tribes living in the Gulf Coast region. The Seminoles were a mixed tribe of runaway slaves, Spaniards, and Creek Indians from Georgia. When they began pillaging Georgia farms, General Andrew Jackson drove them south to this relatively unknown and unexplored region filled with swamps, and further south to the Everglades. My shores were touched by various hostile events, including the Indian Removal Act, the Seminole Indian Wars, and the Civil War. During and after the Civil War, the land near my shores, then called Hickory Hammock, was attracting more and more permanent settlers. One of the first settlers in this area was a man named Peter Bailey. Today, a section of high ground by the Gulf is called Bailey's Bluff, a different spelling, but named for the same man. You may have driven along a street named for Bailey, spelled B-A-I-L-L-I-E, as you drive through Newport Richey. I've heard several stories from travelers on my waters about how Bailey acquired the land. One particularly amusing tale comes from Bailey's days when he was a government surveyor assigned to the Gulf Coast region after the Civil War. His grandson David claims that while surveying the coast, Peter Bailey came across a Tocobaga village at the north end of Tampa Bay. The village chief was stricken with grief because his only son was dying of malaria. Well, the story goes, it just so happened that Bailey had a supply of quinine for his own use, but he gave it to the boy. This broke the boy's fever and restored him to good health. As a reward, the chief took Bailey to the top of a high mound from which you could see miles in all directions. This was the mound I mentioned earlier. With a swing of his arm, the chief gave Bailey the entire region and signed a contract with his own blood. Apparently, this agreement was recorded as a legal document. Some years later, the government paid each of Bailey's heirs $100 to sign a release for the land. That's part of the story of Bailey in this area. It is true that Peter Bailey and a man named Samuel Hope did bring their families here and were among the first settlers. Now, I know you're wondering why the town isn't called Newport Bailey, right? In the 1880s, a small community along my banks was called Hopeville. I imagine named for Samuel Hope or some of his family. I'll get to Richie in a bit. First, a little more about what was going on around here. As you know, in the 1800s, Florida was sparsely populated, but the Armed Occupation Act of 1842 brought several settlers into southern Florida. The act offered 160 acres to anyone who would build a home on the frontier of Florida. This area was considered the frontier. Now I ask you, who wouldn't want to build a home in such a spectacular place? After seeing the beautiful banks along the Chasco River, with its charming vistas and teeming fish and wildlife, not to mention the nearby salt works, to many, this seemed to be the perfect place to settle down and raise a family. Other inducements drew investors to the area. Just south of here, land was going for 25 cents an acre. With more and more settlers coming in, this was the beginning of a land boom. And that brings me back to why my town is called Newport Richey. Are you ready for another short history lesson? It was in 1881 that Aaron McLaughlin Ritchie came to town to visit a friend who owned land on the Gulf Coast. Upon seeing the land along the banks of the beautiful Chasco River, he knew this was the place for him. He thought the sunshine and warm climate would be great for his ailing wife and an ideal spot to raise his children. Richie negotiated with a man named Felix Sowers and bought his house, 76 acres, and an orange grove on a point of land at the mouth of the bank overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. It was paradise. Well, not exactly paradise, but close. The challenge wasn't food and shelter, which the family had, but was the connection to the modern world. Richie had to travel horseback through the woods for supplies to the nearest town, which was Tarpon Springs. Now he found the best way around would be by water. So he purchased a schooner from a local shipbuilder somewhat north of Cedar Key. When asked the name of the port that the schooner would be registered, Richie replied, can you guess? He called his home Port Richie. From then on, A.M. Richie went by Captain Richie, and the name Port Richie replaced the earlier name of Hopeville. Now, with better, faster transportation, Richie could get supplies not only for himself, but also for his neighbors. So he opened up a small store in his house, and as a further convenience to the community, he opened a post office in his house. Soon, the entire area along the banks of the stunning river was known as Port Richie, but it remained sparsely populated. At the beginning of the 20th century, that began to change. In 1904, a group of wealthy men from Georgia opened the Arapika sawmill to develop the land. Now, the timber industry was quite productive, given the dense growth of palms, palmettos, cypress, oak, and pine. The very woodland that kept this population sparse is now what was attracting more residents. But when the timber was gone, so were most of the families. Fortunately, this led to another enterprise. A man named Peter Weeks bought the cleared land and opened the Port Richie Company to develop the land. Weeks was no fool. He saw the land as a prime spot for growth. What made the cleared land especially appealing, in addition to the beautiful Cody River, was a pristine lake. You know it as Orange Lake, just 200 yards from me. Now, with a great deal of foresight, the new Port Richie Company hired a manager, Mr. W.E. Guilford, who laid out a map for a future town with a grid of streets running north to south to be named after presidents and east to west to be named after states. Now, Port Richie was a planned community, ready for business and overflowing with potential. I know you're wondering, where is new Port Richie in all this? I'm getting there. With a great little city at hand, the next question for Guilford was, where do we find the buyers, the investors, the people looking to build a home in sunny Florida? To draw attraction from the north, Guilford placed many advertisements in northern newspapers. In 1912, the Tampa Bay Hotel had a visitor by the name of Fred Sass from Missouri. When Sass left Missouri, the temperature was 5 degrees below zero. After spending about 3 weeks searching for his idea of the promised land, Sass became acquainted with the Port Richie Company in their Tampa office. Mr. Guilford from that office was more than happy to drive Mr. Sass to see the Port Richie land. Even though the road getting here was an old dirt road and the town only had a few buildings in it, Sass was particularly impressed by one, a half-finished hotel close to Orange Lake. After a peaceful boat ride down, what river? Yes, the Cody River. He was enchanted by the possibilities. He bought the hotel and made it a fixture for the growing community. Of course, it didn't hurt that Mrs. Sass, who was the first woman to live in the newly developed town, was an excellent cook and hostess. Soon, she was hosting monthly dinners at 35 cents a plate. Especially popular was her fish fry, said fish from my abundant waters, naturally. In addition to being entrepreneurs, Mr. and Mrs. Sass were very community-minded. Mrs. Sass organized the Port Richey Settlers Benefit Club to improve community involvement, and her husband, Fred, entertained guests at the inn by feeding a 9-foot alligator named Jack, who lived in Orange Lake. The guests were delighted when Jack lunged up and snapped the meat out of the stick in Fred's hand. When Jack grew somewhat too big for everyone's comfort, this entertainment ceased. Be mindful, wherever there's a pond of water in Florida, you will find alligators. Alligators or not, the town was growing and more people were taking an interest in its success. One such person was Gerben DeVries, who came to Florida on doctor's orders to recuperate from a long bout of malaria. He and his wife built a 2-room house on Main Street, and they were very contented with life in this friendly little town. When Mr. DeVries regained his health, he took an avid interest in improving the town. One such improvement was the postal service. Since the road between the town's growing area was still thickly overgrown with trees, there was very hard time getting mail from the Port Richey. Now, I've confused you. You're thinking, aren't we in Port Richey? Let's take a brief moment for a geography review. You are right and wrong. Since Captain Richey called his home Port Richey, the area north and up along the Gulf Coast is considered Port Richey. The area south of the river and moving inland along my banks is where we are now, separated from the business area of coastal Port Richey, still thickly overgrown with trees and brush. Now do you see why there was difficulty getting the mail? Okay, let's get back to Mr. DeVries. One of DeVries' jobs was to get the mail for the Port Richey Land Office and others in town. Now this wasn't an entirely unpleasant job, as he fished as he rode along. He was expected to bring back 2 fish for every letter. Well, when the population grew too large, this practice was discontinued. Logically, the solution was to get a post office of their own, so the mail could be delivered directly to the townspeople. To accomplish this, Mr. DeVries circulated 2 petitions. One was for the post office, and the second was to make him postmaster. Both were signed by all 80 residents in the surrounding area. Now, the land company worked hard to establish the name Port Richey in their northern advertising. So, to avoid confusion, they called the post office, one word, Newport Richey. Subsequently, they found out there was already a town called Newport, Florida. Therefore, they changed it to, you guessed it, Newport, 2 words, Richey. When the rail service was extended from Newport Richey to Elford, Newport Richey got another boost. The Tampa and Gulf Coast Rail Company came to Elford, supported by the Elford Citrus Growers Association, to provide transportation for their goods and workers. Now, with the population growing in Newport Richey, the Tug and Grunt, as the rail service was fondly called by the locals, extended another 6 miles into the downtown area, making Newport Richey its last stop before heading north. The train made 2 stops daily, and the entire town turned out to greet its passengers. Now that Newport Richey was connected to the mainstream population of Tampa, the town's movers and shakers felt this little town was headed for something special. Oh, so many wonderful things continued happening. Let me consult my diary. I don't want to miss anything. Ah, yes. A new hotel, the Grand Rapids Inn, was built and immediately added to, then reorganized as Hotel Newport. Our first newspaper, the Newport Richey Post, published its first edition in January 1916. Following shortly were the Newport Richey Drugstore and Soda Fountain, W.H. Valentine's Dry Goods Store, J.W. Clark's Meat Market, W.A. Casey's Barber Shop, Dr. Posey's office, and many more exciting additions. We built a 2-story school on Main Street, reinforcing the other 4 schools in the area. I say we because I feel I'm an inseparable part of this town. Anything that happens in this town, I'm an integral part of, and I love where I am. Oh, enough about me. Let's get back to the marvelous improvements being made to our beloved little city. The city leaders acquired the first fire truck in 1917. And although our thoroughfares were still mostly muddy lanes, automobiles were appearing on the streets as the northern visitors could now afford Henry Ford's Model T for their trips to sunny Florida. Oh, I relished the feeling I had something to do with attracting visitors and future residents to our town. I mentioned automobiles, but at first, our most common means of transportation was horses and oxen. However, with the appearance of more automobiles, paved roads became the town's next challenge. Since each state would be responsible for their portion of the highway, the Florida State Highway System was created to construct their part of Dixie Highway. Did you know that Dixie Highway had 2 routes from the north? One came from Detroit to Miami, and the second was from Chicago to Naples. Maybe some of you traveled on one of those routes to get here today. Responsibility for paving the road fell to the local communities. I proudly played a part in this enormous benefit to the town. Crushed rock, dredged from me, the Cody River, was used to pave Grand Boulevard. Thus, Grand Boulevard from Newport Richey to Elfers became part of Dixie Highway, bringing travelers right through the heart of this infant city. Soon, another astute businessman would lead the next leap forward for Newport Richey. George Sims and his wife Marjorie came from Detroit looking for a winter home. They purchased the Port Richey Company and 14,000 acres along the banks of the Cody River. In addition to selling home sites, Mr. Sims had his eye on another enterprise which he thought would fit right in to the location and climate of Newport Richey. All right. Now, I don't want to miss anything. There is so much history in this area. All right. In 1916, they purchased the land along the river. And while George worked, Marjorie motored up and down the river. She loved the banks along the river and decided she wanted her home to be built there, instead of in town where George wanted to build. Well, you know who won that argument. Let me share Mr. Sims' idea with you. The fledgling motion picture industry was looking to move from cold northern locations to warmer climates. Hollywood was becoming the primary location for making movies. However, most of the people involved were in eastern cities like New York and Chicago. Travel was still an issue in the 20s. George Sims thought Newport Richey had as good a shot as anywhere to become the Hollywood of the East. To accomplish this, two items proved to be impediments. Florida's high humidity was uncomfortable to work in and made the actors' makeup run. The second barrier to the industry was the lack of monetary incentives for an expensive industry, like making movies, that had big expenses to move here. Yes, we were experiencing a land boom, but we did not yet have the economic infrastructure to support an expensive industry like making movies. Despite these drawbacks, we did draw attention from production companies. In the meantime, the infrastructure and community involvement improved. The social and cultural underpinnings grew with the arrival of Dr. L. Roy Avery. He was a highly educated and active public servant. He was a teacher, a superintendent, a writer, and an Ohio senator. He was also an avid reader and brought with him his collection of over 1,000 books, which he used to start the town's first public library and historical society. He was such a benefactor to the town that he became known as the grand old man of Newport Richey. Soon thereafter, a flurry of improvements came to town. In 1919, Warren Burns from New York and his brother Clyde from Chicago came to town to build an electric company. The Gulf City Utility Company used coal-fired steam engines and soon strung electric lights throughout the town, which became ablaze with Edison's incandescent light bulbs. At the same time, Warren Burns built an ice factory. That same year, the telephone came to town. This newfangled invention connected homes and businesses throughout the town. With all this technology at hand, Newport Richey was unique among small towns. The intersection of Main Street and Grand Boulevard saw the building of the town's first brick structures. One housed the Port Richey Company, one was the First State Bank, and the third was a 2-story mercantile building with 4 apartments on the second floor. All 3 buildings are still standing today, so be sure to look for them as you walk down the boulevard. Another important building constructed during this time was the Palms Theater, which showed silent movies every Saturday night. As things grew on, Newport Richey was on to greater things that the Category 3 hurricane of 1921 could not derail. All in all, Newport Richey survived the storm, with only some damage to a few woodsheds, rooftops, and barns. After cleaning up the streets and the adjoining areas, the founding fathers, Gerben DeVries, George Sims, and Dr. L. Roy Avery were determined to make Newport Richey the gateway to tropical Florida. Now in 1922, the Board of Trade came to Mr. DeVries to come up with a marketing plan that would attract buyers to the newly constructed area. He had to look no farther than Tampa for an idea that seemed to work. Tampa came up with a fictional tale involving a pirate, Jose Gaspar, who attacked the city. And voila, the Gasparilla Festival was born. He thought Newport Richey needed such a rousing tale filled with pageantry to build a festival around. So he came up with the idea of an attack with Indians and Spaniards who fought a battle on the Chasco River. No matter the tribe he chose, Calusa or Calusha, had lived far to the south of here. Thus was born, you know it, Chasco Fiesta, the fictional tale involving an attack on the Spaniards, leaving only 3 survivors, was published in the local newspaper. Of the 3 survivors, 2 were teenagers, Don Felipe and Dona Isabel. Of course, these 2 people took new Indian names, Pithla and Chasco, who became King Pithla and Queen Chasco, who ruled over the 3-day festival. The first festival occurred on March 2nd, 1922, with a parade along the boulevard. A carnival atmosphere was created in Enchantment Park. There were food stands, games, pony rides, and horse and car races around Orange Lake. The first festival brought thousands to Newport Richey and raised more than $1,000 for the Avery Library. The cabaret and vaudeville acts at the Palms Theater played to packed houses and brought in around $400. To all concerned, the Chasco Fiesta was a success and remains so today. In fact, it is one of the largest city-sponsored events in the entire state. And I must confess, I love seeing all the people have such fun on my banks and in boat rides on my waters. Those enjoying the original festivities were a mix of residents and visitors, leading to those visitors becoming future residents. What else can I tell you? There are just so many facts. The continuing growth of the community made it very clear that just a few civic-minded men and women could not sustain the growth of Newport Richey. What was needed was a formal government structure to guide the future development of the town. So the residents voted to incorporate in 1924, and the first mayor, Dr. Elroy Avery, was voted for, along with a town clerk, a marshal, and 7 city council members. The first order of business was to obtain an ordinance to accept from George Sims all of Enchantment Park, including all the accoutrements and the wooden bridge across the Cody River. The park was renamed from Enchantment to Sims Park in honor of Mr. Sims, a fitting tribute since he had given them such a generous gift. Let's see. At this point, the city was growing, and it didn't take long for the residents to notice problems that came along with the growth. With no ordinances against it, livestock and gators were free to roam the streets. This was not attractive to residents and future buyers. This problem was solved by putting a fence around Orange Lake, but a bigger, more serious problem came in the form of crooked real estate agents who sold land to buyers sight unseen. Frequently, the land turned out not as described, and Florida was getting a bad reputation. Thankfully, Newport Richey had a good reputation regarding land deals, which the city leaders were careful to maintain, so new land deals kept coming in. But again, with all this good, there came bad. The city's infrastructure could not keep up with the growth. But once again, the efficient leaders got ahead of the problem by allocating money for better roads, sidewalks with street lamps, and bridges. Many of the downtown roads were paved, and just 2 years after this project, Main Street was extended across the Cody by way of a new concrete bridge which replaced the old wooden bridge. Unlike many cities in Florida, Newport Richey felt ready to take the next steps in its growth. We were attracting wealthy people from the north. Many of the elite northerners who headed south were business owners, manufacturers, and industrialists looking for new opportunities. Soon, Newport Richey had a bicycle maker, an auto manufacturer, and new real estate companies who concentrated on creating more exclusive developments for more affluent buyers. Catering to the wealthy meant upgrading the town's amenities, including the amusement venues. The Palms Theater was hugely popular, but the dirt floor and bench seating was far from appealing to the wealthy. This led to the formation of a corporation comprised of 6 local investors who were the Richey Amusement Company, whose sole purpose was to create a more elaborate theater that would become the pride of the city. The theater was built, and I can't tell you how exciting the next few years were in Newport Richey. Just thinking about it makes me bubble over. Pardon my exuberance. I will tell you some of the exciting things. Okay. The new Spanish-style theater was built, and it was equipped to show movies as well as hold live stage performances. George Sims, who had already done so much to ensure the growth of Newport Richey, recruited other businessmen to bring theater newcomers to relocate to Newport Richey. Sims had been spending his summers in Great Neck in New York, a place popular with the Manhattan theatrical crowd, so the Committee of Newport Richey businessmen got together and sold the virtues of their Florida town to people connected with Broadway, whose performers were becoming movie stars. George Sims saw no reason why Newport Richey couldn't be the new location for this northern movie colony. Soon, the press was announcing that Broadway millionaires were buying home sites in Newport Richey, many along the banks of Cody River. Movie stars, producers, and musicians were among the first wave of celebrities to come to town. One of the most famous was Hollywood handsome leading man Thomas Meehan and his brother James, who was a real estate agent. Both felt they were getting in on the ground floor of something special, and they were. Thomas, anytime he walked down the boulevard, all the ladies swooned as he walked by. He was not just a snowbird, as we call the northern time visitors now, but he built a mansion on my west bank, registered to vote, and made his home in what he called the most beautiful and home-like city in all of Florida. He was such an elaborate part of the town that they named the theater the Thomas Meehan Theater. It was rumored that Gloria Swanson, Charlotte Benham, and George Holland were among the first celebrities to come to town. From the music industry came Earl Benham, Irving Berlin, orchestra leader Paul Whitman, and the #1 movie producer, Sam Harris. Oh, there were too many famous show business people to name now. It seemed George Sims' idea of making Newport Richey the Hollywood of the East was well on its way to become a reality. Sports figures were also attracted to the town when it was noted that another activity needed by the rich and famous, so they built the Jasmine Point Golf Club, and again, Thomas Meehan was called upon to lure his friend, golfer Gene Sarazen, to help design and be the club's pro. Sarazen built a home near Meehan's and intended on making Newport Richey his home. And he did for 4 years, but a disaster was looming that would affect the entire country. More about that in a moment. In the meantime, the mid-20s brought great things to Newport Richey. Now remember, all these people were staying in our hotels. At the time, there were 5, eating in our restaurants and shopping in our stores. As a result, more stores and businesses were added to the boulevard. Groundbreaking for a luxury hotel occurred on August 11, 1926, the Newport Richey Community Hotel. And of course, it kept with the prominent style of the area and was Spanish in design. It consisted of 50 guest rooms with private baths, telephones, steam heat, and wall-to-wall carpeting. It had 3 lounges in addition to the main salon, a dining hall with a mahogany bar, and 3 small bedrooms to accommodate the staff who were not local. Contrary to popular rumors, the underground tunnel was not for smuggling booze, but to carry waste to the river. Ugh, I was not overly pleased with this pollution to my beautiful waters. But every house along the banks did the same thing. Oh, don't worry. The city's sewage system is much more advanced today. In 1926, the structure was christened the Hacienda Hotel, and the keynote speaker was George Sims's good friend, famous comedian Ed Wynn. On February 5, 1927, the hotel's doors were opened for the townspeople, followed by a formal opening with a banquet and professional orchestra. The Hacienda was a success. Many of the rich and famous kept it booked near capacity during the winter months. Newport Richey was not looked upon as some small, off-the-beaten-path town, but was a beautiful resort destination. Good things continued happening in Newport Richey, and even though the land boom in the rest of Florida was over by 1928, wealthy investors kept coming to the city, and the winter season of 1929 was expected to be the biggest ever. But things were looming. All 7 hotels were still booked, though, near capacity. The Palms Theater was renovated, and the Thomas Meehan Theater added sound to accommodate talkies. All stores were fully stocked, and Sims Park added several outdoor recreational venues, including a dock giving access to my waters. Something else happened to me that wasn't entirely pleasant. I was dredged to create a deeper channel to the Gulf in anticipation of larger yachts arriving in the winter. For the golfers, improvements were planned for the Jasmine Point Golf Club, including 9 more holes, a casino, a clubhouse, and a pavilion. As you can see, things were still booming in Newport Richey. Well, you know what happened on October 29, 1929, but the stock market crash did not make headlines in our newspapers. Instead, it was full of the plans for the upcoming winter season. Celebrities continued coming to the city, many as guests of the Meehans, and there was a rumor going around that MGM was looking at Newport Richey as a filming location. But as 1929 wore on, 3 of them signaled that all was not well, and residents began to worry. 1, Bayshore Estates stumbled when many buyers pulled out of their contracts, and folks were worried that Jasmine Estates would also falter. 2, when beautification projects were undertaken, it was looked at as desperation and not as the best use of the city's money. And 3, when Gene Sarazen won a big prize, but deposited his money in his New York bank instead of the local one. Depression was beginning to be felt. Although Newport Richey managed to stay afloat during the Depression, changes needed to be made. City leaders' salaries were cut. The streetlights were turned off in many areas, and the library was closed. The hardest blow came with the closing of the First State Bank in the spring of 1931, and the failure of the Jasmine Point Golf Club. In 1934, Gene Sarazen cut ties to the golf club and sold his home, but he stayed in the town he loved for 2 more years until 1936. In 1936, Thomas Meehan passed away from cancer. In just one very sad year, we lost our most famous and influential ambassadors. The mid-30s were a very troubling time for me and for the city. We lost several of our most important and beloved citizens, including the grand old man of Newport Richey, Dr. Elroy Avery, who died at the age of 91. Since Newport Richey was built on people and not on business or industry, it seemed our lifeblood was draining away. We would never fulfill the promise of our illustrious past. But don't count us down and out yet. You never know when a fresh burst of energy will come along. Just east of the city lies a beautiful lake made from my drainage basin. An area businessman, Ed Haley, had plans to turn Moon Lake and the surrounding acreage into a fully stocked hunting and fishing refuge. The project was started in 1933 and was fully operational by 1936. Haley knew he had to attract more than just hunters and fishermen, so to encourage stays from the entire family and affluent tourists, Moon Lake Gardens and Dude Ranch was created. When finished, this magnificent ranch would include a grand lodge, cozy cabins, riding stables, fishing piers, boardwalks, a casino, various dining venues, exotic gardens, and a dance hall. And who do you think will build this magnificent dream? At a time when we needed it most, Newport Richey supplied almost 200 construction workers and hundreds of men, women, and teenagers to work in the service industry. When opened, the large ranch attracted the visitors who stayed at the Hacienda Hotel and was wildly successful. But trouble for the whole United States was looming on the horizon. With America's entry into World War II came the rationing of cars, tires, gas, and food, all the things needed to help the tourist industry. In 1941, the Moon Lake Gardens and Dude Ranch was closed. The effect of the combined Depression and World War II was an economic slowdown nationwide, and Newport Richey was no exception. We returned to being a small, out-of-the-way Florida town. But the decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s saw several changes to our city. First, with very few people making any money, our cost of living became the lowest in the nation. We became a retirement community. In fact, by no less a respected publication than Consumer Reports, we were the most affordable place to retire in the entire country. Second, with the expansion of US 19, the business district changed its focus to smaller shops and businesses. And the third event, believe it or not, was the advent of central air conditioning. Many retirees found Newport Richey to be a peaceful and comfortable place to retire in the 1970s. Among the influx of retirees was the country music Carter family. Pop and Mother Maybelle Carter bought a small cottage on the mouth of the Cody River. Now, when Carter passed away, she left the bungalow to her daughter June, who was married to Johnny Cash. You see, we were still attracting celebrities. For more than 30 years, the Cashes visited their bungalow on the river. But just before his passing in 2003, they sold their home on the Cody. After 60 years, our beautiful hacienda stopped working as a hotel and for a time became a treatment facility. The city bought the hotel in 2003 with plans to return it to its former grandeur. A grant was obtained with the help of Senator Wilton Simpson some major repairs were made to the foundation, the flooring, and the roof. It was offered for a bid and purchased by Mr. Gunderson, who owned Lakeside Inn in Mount Dora. Despite the virus pandemic that stopped many activities, work continued slowly on the hacienda until its official reopening on February 5th, 2023, the exact date of its original opening in 1927. The 21st century brought a mini renaissance to our town, bringing in many families instead of only retirees. Other factors include rebuilding in our education, medical care, our recreational activities, and many improvements in public safety. The last few years, many downtown buildings have been given new life, with new businesses taking a hold, including new bakeries, gift shops, tea shops, microbreweries, and many restaurants offering everything from simple fare like hot dogs and grilled cheese to more upscale cuisine with lobster and escargot and prime rib. The new housing projects like Main Street Landing and the Central, overlooking the beautiful river, will remain the historical identity of the downtown area. Remember, we still have many buildings in the original style of the hacienda. One such building is the Thomas Meehan Theater, which is now the Ritchie Suncoast Theater. Thanks to the efforts of various dedicated citizens, this theater will reflect the beauty of its inception in the 20s. Now that you know some of our history, be sure to take a walk down the boulevard and along my banks to see the magnificent mansions remaining, a reminder of the rich tapestry of Newport Richie's glorious past. And if you go by Johnny and June Cash's bungalow at Miller's Bayou, look just a few doors down, and you'll see the large mound left by the Tocobaga Indians 1,000 years earlier. Well, it seems we have come full circle since our talk began. Do you now know how to pronounce my name? Pitla Chasco. I hope you enjoy me and all my wonderful town has to offer.
Everyone, Ashley Rosendrick.